The story begins in a small town in Norway, surrounded by massive mountain ranges. There we are introduced to Christian, a geologist, the kind of person who studies and analyzes the changes happening inside the earth. Christian lived in the town with his family and had spent almost his entire life there. After finishing his office work, he would go straight home to be with his family. His wife, Iden, worked as a hotel receptionist, and they had 2 children, a son named Sandra and a daughter named Julia. Together they were a perfect family, enjoying life in this beautiful place. But as stunning as the town was, it was equally dangerous, and none of them had any idea that nature itself would soon put all their lives at risk. One day, while having lunch with his family, Christian was reminded that it was his last day at his job. He had resigned and was transferring to a higher post in another city. At the office, he joined his colleagues, who were constantly monitoring the stability of the surrounding mountains with advanced equipment placed deep inside the rocks. Their biggest concern was a particular mountain that was unstable and could one day collapse. When Christian arrived, he noticed unusual changes on the monitors caused by several devices on the mountain going offline. Concerned, he told his colleagues to look into it, but since it was his final day, they didn't want him working and instead threw him a celebration to honor his career. For a while, he let himself enjoy the moment and forgot about the troubling signs. Later that evening, back home, the family prepared to move to their new city. But Christian kept staring at charts of mountain readings, unsettled by the possibility that something catastrophic was about to happen. To him, the silence felt like the calm before the storm. Iden tried to reassure him, saying they should focus on their transfer and the new life ahead, but Christian couldn't shake the feeling. The next day, while taking his kids to the harbor, he looked up at the mountains again and couldn't stop thinking about the danger they posed despite their beauty. The readings kept replaying in his mind, showing a steady decline. Unable to ignore it, Christian rushed back to the office with his children, insisting to his colleagues that something was wrong. He argued that the changes inside the mountains were real, even if invisible, and that ignoring the offline sensors could be disastrous. His colleagues trusted his instincts, since Christian's predictions had always been accurate. So they joined him in a helicopter to check the devices firsthand. After landing, they made their way into a gap within the mountain range, where several machines were installed to monitor the geological activity and detect any critical changes beneath the surface. Christian and his colleague went down to a lower area during their inspection and discovered a wire that had been deliberately cut. That was the reason why several monitoring systems in the mountain ranges had gone offline. While it could have been repaired, Christian felt something more was going on. He collected all the reports and returned to the office, explaining to his colleagues that this was not a small issue. According to him, something significant was happening within the mountains, and the damaged wires and devices were a warning. He believed that massive sections of the mountains were slowly pulling apart, and if that continued, the disturbance in the water could trigger a tsunami. And not an ordinary one. These mountains were so huge that if they collapsed into the fjord, the resulting waves could reach tens of meters high, powerful enough to wipe out the entire village and even the nearby cities. But his colleagues didn't seem interested. To them, it was just a minor fluctuation in the readings, nothing worth launching an emergency operation over. Christian insisted that sirens should be activated immediately so the villagers could be evacuated, warning that if they delayed, people would not have a chance to escape. Christian, who had spent years working on that post and knew every detail of the geology, was ignored. Since it was no longer his job, his opinions were dismissed outright. Disheartened, he returned to his car where his children were supposed to be waiting, only to find them missing. They had left a note saying they had gone to be with their mother, whom they adored and spent most of their time with. Worried, Christian rushed to the hotel to find his wife Iden, where Sandra and Julia were already with her. Because of a change in her work shift, she hadn't gone in that night. Christian decided that the very next day, they would leave the town for good, because it was no longer safe. Meanwhile, back at the office, another worker on duty noticed disturbing changes on the monitors. The pressure readings from the mountain devices were spiking, suggesting that massive geological movement was underway. Alarmed, he reported it to his seniors, who quickly sent 2 men to investigate the devices located deep within the mountain gaps. As they checked the instruments one by one, they suddenly felt unusual tremors and shifts within the mountains, movements that shouldn't have been happening yet. This was the very danger Christian had predicted. Back home, Christian also began sensing that something terrible was about to unfold. To understand why massive tsunamis happen, one must know the causes. The first is undersea earthquakes. When tectonic plates beneath the ocean floor shift, the seabed suddenly moves, forcing huge amounts of water upward in a vertical motion, creating gigantic waves that can travel across vast distances at hundreds of kilometers per hour. Another cause is volcanic eruptions. Many volcanoes lie beneath the ocean, and when they erupt, the sudden surge in water intensity can evolve into devastating tsunamis. But in this case, the cause was something else. If massive mountains were to break apart and collapse into the water, that alone could generate an enormous force beneath the surface, creating waves powerful enough to destroy an entire city. The question was how the townspeople would survive the disaster that was fast approaching. Christian had suspected it from the beginning, but now he was steadily finding confirmation. He could feel the vibrations inside the mountains, and to him they were clear warnings of an oncoming catastrophe. He even noticed flocks of birds flying in strange, frantic formations as if in panic. It's often said that animals can sense natural disasters before humans, and the erratic behavior of the birds only reinforced Christian's fears. He began reviewing the reports he had gathered, comparing them with the past month's records, which showed increasing changes in the mountains that could lead to the very disaster he had long predicted. Meanwhile, the two workers inside the range ignored the minor vibrations, assuming it was nothing unusual. But soon, small fragments of rock began falling from above. They dismissed it as strong winds, unaware of the danger, and pushed further inside to collect readings for their report. On the other side, Christian urgently called headquarters, warning them that the mountain movements had intensified and could collide at any moment, causing a massive explosion of force. He begged them to recall the workers before it was too late, but the staff still hesitated. Then their own monitoring systems began showing alarming pressure spikes inside the mountains, proving that Christian was right all along. The systems triggered full alerts as the data confirmed that two colossal mountain walls were on the verge of colliding. At the site, one of the workers was suddenly crushed by a falling boulder that pinned his leg, trapping him. Both of them were now in critical danger, and the gap they had entered was rapidly closing as the mountains pressed together. Their survival was impossible. When headquarters realized the gravity of the situation, they finally activated the town's sirens, signaling everyone to evacuate immediately. Panic swept through the village as people scrambled to flee. Christian rushed straight home to save his children, while the two trapped workers exchanged one final glance before the mountain slammed shut, crushing them mercilessly. The collision unleashed enormous vibrations through the water, shaking everything around. Massive rocks tumbled into the fjord, driving the water level even higher. Headquarters broadcasted announcements urging everyone to move to higher ground. At the hotel, Aiden heard the sirens and immediately understood the danger. She began evacuating all the guests, determined to save lives even while desperate to reach her own children. With the help of her colleagues, she cleared the hotel as quickly as possible. Chaos spread everywhere, and then the feared sight became reality. Towering waves rose from the water, surging directly toward the town. Christian warned that they had only minutes left. If people didn't escape in that time, everyone would die. He quickly pulled his children from the car and started running uphill, but the problem was that the roads were jammed with vehicles as terrified residents sat frozen inside, blocking the way. Panic consumed the town as people realized the tsunami was almost upon them. Christian urged everyone he passed to leave their cars and run toward higher ground. The atmosphere was chaos, with frightened families screaming and scrambling as the massive waves surged closer, waves so powerful they could swallow entire countries, and now only minutes remained. Christian kept climbing with Julia while the walls of water approached. At the hotel, Aiden had managed to evacuate most of the guests and arranged for a bus to carry them out, but then discovered her son, Sandra, was missing. Heart-pounding, she frantically searched floor after floor, shouting his name, but he was nowhere in sight. She tried calling, but the phone network was already down. Meanwhile, Christian glanced at his watch. Less than a minute remained, and the waves between the mountains towered higher than anything anyone had ever seen. Then he spotted a woman trapped between two cars, her leg caught. She would be killed if left behind. Without hesitation, he handed Julia over to a neighbor, telling them to keep moving uphill, and rushed to help. Struggling, he managed to free the woman, but the tsunami was already upon them, swallowing everything in its path. Realizing there was no way to outrun it, Christian pushed the woman into a car for shelter and climbed in himself as the waves thundered forward, destroying everything in their way. Whether they survived was uncertain. Back at the hotel, Aiden still hadn't found Sandra. Sirens blared and orders to evacuate echoed, but then she realized she hadn't checked the basement. Rushing downstairs, she finally found him, casually riding his skateboard, oblivious to the catastrophe outside. Grabbing his hand, she pulled him toward the exit along with several others trapped below. But when they emerged, the evacuation bus had already departed. Ahead of them loomed a monstrous shadow, not of any creature, but of the massive tsunami itself, a force of nature more terrifying than a giant beast. With no time left and nowhere safe in the open, Aiden and the others had no choice but to retreat back into the hotel, praying for a chance to survive. Everyone began rushing toward the hotel's basement because it was the only place that seemed safe enough to survive such a massive tsunami. People helped one another as they moved down, but water had already started to flood the area, and more than half of the building's structure was collapsing. Carla somehow made it into the basement with her son, but one of her friends drowned in the rising water. Trapped in this desperate situation where death seemed certain, they all worked together to shut the basement doors to keep the water out, yet the force of the waves was so strong that water still seeped in. Carla held her son close in a safer spot and prayed for things to get better, but the water level kept rising fast. Within seconds, more than half the town was already submerged, its entire infrastructure destroyed. If we ever found ourselves in such a condition, with enormous waves rushing toward us, survival would depend on following expert techniques. If there is any warning of a tsunami, one must immediately climb to the highest possible ground or reach the top floors of a tall building. In most recorded tsunamis, the waves have not exceeded a certain height, meaning survival chances increase if we move higher than that level. The water may look slow from a distance, but once it reaches you, it surges with terrifying speed. And if, despite climbing high, the waves still catch you and start to drag you away, the only way to survive is to cling tightly to anything floating to stay above the surface, because once pulled deep under those massive waves, survival becomes nearly impossible. Tsunami waters usually keep surging for hours before finally settling back into the ocean, so one must hold on until it subsides. Meanwhile, Christian was shown slowly opening his eyes inside his wrecked, overturned car. The vehicle was badly damaged, and when he looked at the woman beside him, he saw she had been killed by an iron rod piercing her body. Shaken, Christian somehow managed to crawl out of the broken car. For the moment, one of the massive waves had passed, but the destruction left behind was so severe that the city was unrecognizable. Terrified by the power of nature's wrath, Christian hurried to search for his daughter Julia. Thankfully, she was safe with the neighbors and ran to hug her father the moment she saw him. But Christian knew he still had to save his wife and son, who he was sure had gone to the hotel and probably climbed to the top floors for safety. That meant their lives were in grave danger. If the building collapsed, everyone inside would die. Handing Julia over to the neighbors for safety, he urged them to keep moving uphill. Julia begged him not to leave, but Christian had no choice. He had to find the rest of his family. He set off in search of the bus headed toward the hotel, unaware that an even greater danger was still approaching. At the hotel, water was now flooding into the basement where Carla and her son Sandra were trapped. She tried to take him to a safer spot, but the basement walls were weakening fast. Water kept pouring in, and once those walls gave way completely, the basement would be entirely submerged. Carla and Sandra tried desperately to hold the doors shut, but the unstoppable weight of thousands of tons of water made their efforts useless. Carla began looking desperately for any other possible way out of the basement. They eventually found a ventilation chamber, but escaping through it was impossible because the walls were so narrow that almost no human could pass through. When they came back down, everyone grew even more terrified, wondering what would happen next. How could they escape the basement without opening the doors? If they opened them, the water would obviously rush in. With Carla and her son now stood another man whose wife had drowned in the flood. His mind had completely broken. He began arguing with Carla, demanding that she get him out. Shocked by his wife's death and trapped in such a hopeless situation, he was suffering panic attacks and acting irrationally. Yet in this dangerous condition, they had no choice but to work together, or none of them would survive. Meanwhile, Christian kept traveling through the wreckage until he reached the spot where a hotel bus had crashed. Inside it, all the other survivors had once sat. The scene around him was pure destruction. Christian climbed into the wrecked bus, praying not to find his wife and son among the dead. Sadly, every passenger had already been killed. At one point, he thought he saw his son inside, but it was only his imagination. Realizing his family wasn't there, Christian turned back toward the hotel. The upper floors where Carla worked had already been destroyed, and in the basement the water level kept rising. It had reached their necks, forcing them to keep their heads tilted upward just to breathe. Carla and her son tried to force the door open, but heavy fallen pillars on the other side kept it jammed. Despite repeated attempts, nothing worked, and Phillips, the man who had lost his wife, panicked even further. In desperation, he began shoving Carla and Sandra under the water just to keep himself breathing longer. The scene turned violent, and young Sandra realized that if Phillips stayed with them, he would kill them both. With his mother's help, Sandra pushed Phillips under the water, holding him down until he drowned. It was a cruel moment, but survival left them no choice. Sometimes, to live, you must take another's life. Still, there was no guarantee Carla and her son would last much longer in that flooding chamber. By this time, Christian had already reached the hotel. He searched floor by floor for his wife and son, eventually heading toward the basement. But seeing it completely filled with water, he didn't dare go inside. He had no idea his wife and child were trapped right there. Instead, he first went to the hotel room where they had stayed, desperately hoping to find them alive. Seeing his son's backpack and several other belongings, Christian began to fear the worst, that they hadn't survived. Overcome with grief, he smashed a pipe against the wall in sheer frustration. The loud banging sent vibrations through the building, and by some miracle, Carla and her son heard the sound. They realized someone was outside and began making noise themselves to get attention. Soon after, Christian caught the faint sounds and rushed straight toward the basement. Without hesitation, he dove into the flooded chamber and tried to open the door. But heavy pillars had collapsed against it, jamming it shut. Desperately, Christian started clearing the debris, now fully aware his wife and son were trapped inside. After a tense struggle, they finally managed to open the door. Christian sent his wife up first, then went back to rescue Sandra. The whole ordeal felt impossible to survive, but he kept giving his son courage. He told him that no matter how dangerous things looked, they had to focus on the better world waiting for them outside. Motivated by his father's words, Sandra made his way out. But Christian became stuck and couldn't escape. Carla quickly went back down and pulled her husband out. He wasn't even breathing. She dragged him outside and began CPR. Thankfully, after a few moments, Christian regained consciousness. The three of them immediately fled the building and made it to the spot where the remaining survivors had gathered. Their little daughter, Julia, was overjoyed to see her family alive. She ran straight into her parents' arms, hugging them tightly. The entire family was grateful that they had made it out alive. And that's where our story comes to an end.